Okay, Cold War, starting 1945, same year World War II ends. This was kind of something that people saw coming. The United States and the Soviet Union, right? They're strange bedfellows during World War II, justified by the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that sort of thing. At the end of the war, they're both going to occupy Europe. The Allies, Russia, Soviet Union is going to come from the east. The United States is going to invade Sicily in 43, and then France in 44, and march into Central Europe, which is Germany. Germany's really in the center of Europe, right? So they sort of meet in the middle. Berlin is behind what's going to be called the Eastern Bloc, or behind the Iron Curtain, which is a phrase that Winston Churchill comes up with later on, I believe, in the early 60s, after the Berlin Wall has actually been built. But let's look at some of the major components of U.S. policy in regards to leading what's called the West and the First World, right? Soviet Union, Second World. Third World is used to describe all those countries in the middle. It's actually an antiquated term to use now. But let's look at some of the basic policies basic things that shape U.S. policy early on in the Cold War. Right, Truman's going to be president, the first president of the Cold War. There's mixed, you can hear from various sides whether he did a good job, a decent job, or a terrible job. But in 1946, there's a diplomat, a guy named George Kennan, who writes a telegram. It's called the Long Telegram because it's kind of long, really clever title. Zimmerman sends a telegram. It's known as the Zimmerman telegram. This one is not the Kennan telegram. The main word to take away from the Long Telegram, the main word, the word of the day, containment. The policy of containment stems from this telegram, right? Laying out, in 1946, he lays out, basically this is how we're going to handle the threat of global communism, of the expansion around the world of communist states that may or may not be sponsored by the Soviet Union. Communism exists. It exists in the Soviet Union. It exists maybe, right? We're not going to destroy the Soviet Union. We're just going to contain communism from spreading beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, which sometimes Stalin might have a direct hand in it, or the Soviet government might have a direct hand in it. Sometimes it's more of an indigenous, organic thing, like in Cuba or Vietnam. Not to say there's in those situations there was zero connection. A good example would be China, which 3 years after 1946, there's the communist revolution in China, right? If you skip down this list, the People's Republic of China, run by Mao Zedong, is established in 1949. A group that had been operating in the 30s and 40s to try and topple at the time, the current government in China, the Kuomintang. Primarily through countries will have a relationship at this point through the Soviet Union, through what's called the Comintern, the Communist International, training people in socialism, communism, economic, whatever. It's almost like the West Point of socialism or of setting up a communist state, right? And tactics, warfare, right? Military advisors, stuff like that are used. People can go there to learn, basically figure out how to take over your country and how to run it in a communist, with a communist system. China is going to have folks at this Comintern for a long time, but when it comes to the actual fighting in China, it's going to be like it is in Cuba or Vietnam. It's going to be more of a guerrilla style of warfare, not the animal in the zoo, the other guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla, two R's. Guerrilla. Right, which actually, now that I think about it, probably comes from guerra, which is means war. Guerra in Italian. Guerrero, I believe, is Spanish for war. Guerrilla warfare, and the Comintern folks, the Soviet folks, are going to be sort of teaching this more traditional, what we call conventional warfare, right? And it's not going to really work in China under the circumstances. So their relationship is gonna sort of not sour, but they're gonna as early as I think 1936, I want to say, they sort of decide, okay, the Communist Party in China, we're going to go at it our own. We're not going to be that tied to the Soviet Union and their way of doing things, because China is different, right? Countries are different. So not necessarily, I can't remember if George Kennan looks at it like this, looks at it, every communist uprising around the world is stemming somehow from the Soviet Union. Kind of like we look at every sort of uprising that in an Islamic place is stemming from ISIS, previously Al-Qaeda. It used to be Al-Qaeda, now it's ISIS that we think of, like that. I have a Slurpee. So the policy of containment, we're preventing uprisings like China, hopefully, Vietnam, Cuba, although, stuff like that. This sort of relates to, when the Vietnam War, when the United States escalates its presence in Vietnam in the 60s, the idea is there's a domino theory, right? That if Vietnam falls, all of Southeast Asia will fall to a communist government. Similar to containment, right? Because if you let one go, if you let this expand a little bit, it's going to keep going. We have to contain it, So I think domino theory really falls into, which you hear, that phrase a lot if you learn about the Vietnam War, and I feel it really ties into the long telegram policy of containment. And as a result of this, not necessarily a direct result of this solely, but related to this, you have things like the Truman Doctrine, pledging support militarily, otherwise, to any government around the world willing to stem a communist uprising or communist revolution, whether popular or otherwise, right? We will give you money to prop up your government, to prop up your economy. We will give you military if you will defend against communist takeover of your country, whether it's supported by the people or not, right? And whether or not whether the people, that government we're pledging to help is democratic or not, right? Sometimes they're democratic, sometimes they're not. A good example of not being democratic is the situation in Greece in 1947 with, I believe, what was his name, Tito. The important thing to take away from the Cold War that a lot of people misconstrue is that it's not necessarily democracy versus communism. It's capitalism versus communism, right? So in capitalism, with the idea of open markets and access to open markets and around the world, it's the most important thing is stability, right? And the historian who makes this argument, I believe, is Walter Lefebvre. Stability around the world and also access to markets, access to resources, right? If you're business friendly with us, you keep things relatively stable. If you're a democracy, hey, more power to you. That's great. That's awesome. But if they're not a democracy, we tend to look the other way. You see this still today. Look at the Saudi relationship with Saudi Arabia the United States has, or even the relationship with Israel in Israel's relation to Palestine, some would argue. But definitely the Saudi Arabia one. I'm going to have some more Slurpee. The Marshall Plan is focused more specifically on Europe, specifically on rebuilding Europe from war, which also combats communism, right? You have the world that's divided into these two camps. If we start helping out people in our camp, making them look good, making their quality of life look good, right? Then it makes us look better, trying to win over the hearts and minds of the world. So the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, I believe it's $13 billion over the course of a few years after, from 47 to 51. $13 billion are spent on rebuilding Europe. A lot of that's in loans. A lot of this money is paid back to the United States eventually. I believe maybe even all of it, but don't quote me on that one. And also the Central Intelligence Agency is created in 1947. The CIA, right? Global intelligence. I don't know if this is the first time. Obviously, you have spies and stuff during wars around the world, but I believe this is the first agency that, other than like maybe the State Department, Department of War, but that an agency that's going to function, around the entire world, collecting, intelligence, covert operations, in many instances, clandestine stuff. The coup d'etat that takes place in Iran in 1953, the CIA is going to make also 70 plus attempts on the life of Fidel Castro throughout his tenure, beyond taking his life. The ideas such as putting stuff in Castro's food so that his beard would fall out. They assume that people in Cuba will take him less seriously without a beard. More Slurpee. So yeah, the CIA, which I'm sure, which has a history at this point that's 70 years old. Lots of stuff going on in the CIA. Lots of really good stuff. Translators, all sorts of things. All sorts of what you might call legitimate stuff, but also some somewhat clandestine stuff at times. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Mutual defense, the United States pledging the defense of Western countries in Western Europe and with the Soviet Union having pushed into Central Europe, through the Ukraine, Poland, and other places like that, and now occupying half of Germany, surrounding Berlin. Even though the Allies, the United States, the West has a presence in West Berlin, Berlin itself is surrounded by East Germany, the Soviet Union. So militarily coordinating for defense and stuff like that against Soviet aggression. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949, which is the same year that the People's Republic of China is established. I mentioned that. This is going to be something, people say that Truman, because he was president and allowed this country to slip, the largest country on earth, to slip under a communist government, allowed the revolution to be successful. He lost China. Truman lost China, which Truman, I don't believe Harry Truman had a legal deed and title on China. He doesn't own them. They're in a sovereign country. This was a popular movement against a government, the Kuomintang, which was very illegitimate in many ways, very illegitimate, ineffectual, and our own. We had military advisors and diplomats over there. I think it was Stilwell, a guy named Stilwell, Joseph Stilwell, who commented in the 40s. Basically, I'm not sure if he's the specific person who commented on the fact that the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek in World War II, the United States was providing military aid, weapons, to this government that they were not necessarily using against the Japanese because they didn't want to risk losing them, and they wanted to hang on. They basically hung on to them, and so that because Chiang Kai-shek knew this war is going to end eventually, the Allies will defeat Japan, and they fought against Japan too, but with these, a lot of these weapons that we're getting from the United States, we're going to use them in the fight against the communists after the war, right? So that didn't help, obviously. They lost anyways. China had really been since the last dynasties in the late 19th century. The governments that were in place had not really controlled China, right? It was sort of a semi-colonial, it's complicated. But anyways, the People's Republic of China, Truman lost China, of lost China, specifically since it's labeled, I believe, a Democrat, and this is my opinion, has pushed many Democrats to try to be more hawkish, to sound tougher in foreign policy, particularly because a lot of the domestic policies that Truman had, definitely, and Democrats since then, have been socialistic, basically, socialized capitalism. Healthcare, universal healthcare is socialism. Medicare, socialism. Social Security, socialism. Since the Democrats really own these big government programs that could easily be labeled as socialist because they are socialistic, which is, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But as a result of that, they, particularly in the Cold War and fighting communism, had to look tough. So, NSC 68, there's more than likely an assignment for this class that revolves around that, a writing assignment. So you've definitely absorbed that one. Outlining just the stakes of the situation, right? The idea, outlining what the United States is, what it stands for. The idea, I believe Foner says, Foner discusses this in the opening of the chapter on the Cold War, chapter 23. Eric Foner states, the Cold War helped to reshape freedom's meaning, identifying it with anti-communism, free enterprise, and the social and economic status quo. right? And NSC 68 really does that, right? The idea of the individual in the free enterprise, and the idea of combating global communism stemming from the Kremlin. So in NSC 68, communism anywhere around the world is linked to Moscow, the Soviet Union, right? Which is very far from the truth in many instances. So, but the Korean War, let's look at the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Korea had been occupied by Japan since 1910, and after World War II, there's factions within Korea, and it's divided into North and South. The North being run by the communists, and the South being run by some pro-Western government. Then the North invades the South in 1950. The United States comes to the defense of South Korea, which was a government you could argue was propped up by the West, by the United States. But let's not get into that. About sanctioning this conflict, sanctioning coming to the defense of South Korea. And it passes. It passes even over the Security Council at the UN. But here's the deal. China, which had a vote in the United Nations, they had just had a revolution the year before, in 1949. They're not going to be recognized really until the 1970s by the United States. They're not the representative at the United Nations for China is still the Kuomintang, this government that had fled mainland China and occupies Taiwan. That's how Taiwan becomes a separate place from China, and they still debate over it to this day. And so the pro-West Kuomintang government in Taiwan, which was representing China at the UN, gives the go-ahead on supporting the South. So the Americans go in under Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, but still, this country split. North invades the South. American troops go in, support the South Korean troops, and push North Korea back into their own territory, then start pushing them even further to where they're close to the border with China. If you see the map in the background there, the Yalu River. Well, eventually, actually, they get so close to the Chinese border that China hurls hundreds of thousands of troops across the border in support of North Korea, and it starts pushing the United States back, the U.S. and the South Korean army back, to the point where MacArthur starts clamoring about potentially using nuclear weapons against China, and also invading China as a means of alleviating this situation, which Truman says is completely off limits, and they squabble over it. Basically, MacArthur, rather than listening to the president, openly sort of mocks him and ridicules him and says he's wrong. So Truman fires him, and MacArthur at this point was very popular, even though with the bonus army thing in 1932, even after abandoning the Philippines in 1942, 10 years later, but he returns to the Philippines. Is a general during the defeat of the Japan and the sort of U.S. control over the Pacific. Very popular at the end of the war, so he's very popular at this point in 1950, 1951. But in April of 51, he's fired by Truman, who says, and I quote, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I did not fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was. But that's not against the laws for generals. If it was against the law for generals to be dumb, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail." So there's Truman on the military. Needless to say, this, amongst many other things, is going to make Truman somewhat unpopular by the time he leaves office a year and a half later. November 52, there's an election. He's out in January 53. But eventually, this war results in a stalemate around the same area that it began, right? And there's a armistice called, and a 38th parallel is established. Yeah. So at the end of this conflict, lasts 3 years, it ends in a stalemate. It's still in existence today. There's still a border between these two countries. Americans are still there, patrolling that border, and so you have 33,000 Americans who die, which is a substantial number. That's about the fourth. Yeah, I think if you which I don't know if this is twisted or not, but to rank wars based on the number of Americans that have died in them, not rank them as awesome or not awesome, but just to look at wars based on how many Americans died. You have the Civil War is the highest, 600,000, 620,000. But that's what went, obviously, because you're counting both North and South, the two sides fighting in it. So whether or not that's skewed, you can decide. But 620,000 in the Civil War, 400,000 in World War II, over 100,000 in World War I, Vietnam, which is 58,000. And then you have this war. 3 million Koreans die in this war. 3 million. So you have a situation with the Chinese. You have 150 to 400,000. They're not exactly sure, historians aren't exactly sure. But 150,000 to 400,000 Chinese, 33,000 Americans. That's a lot. But if you look at the actual country this war is being fought in, the people, there's the East, there's the West, there's China, there's the U.S., there's the Soviet Union, fighting over these little countries. And in these little countries, their people are the ones that suffer the most. 3 million Koreans. When the Vietnam War is over, some estimates say 5 million Vietnamese will have been killed. Somewhere between 3 and 5.